Hi, everyone. My name is Costa. I'm here from the School of Cities, and I'd like to welcome you to today's session of Knowledge Café featuring Dr. Laura Tozer. Now, before we begin the session, I'd like to start with a short land acknowledgement. The land on which the University of Toronto operates is the traditional lands of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit, and continues to be the gathering place of many Indigenous, Métis, and Inuit peoples from across Turtle Island. We should keep in mind, too, that colonialism is not merely an artifact of the past, but as we speak, thousands of people continue to have their lands stolen from them through war, and they need support now, not just commemoration later. Knowledge Cafe at the School of Cities is brought to you by the School of Cities, the University of Toronto's multidisciplinary center for urban research, education, and engagement, dedicated to discovering new ways for cities and their residents to thrive. The Knowledge Cafe at the School of Cities is a monthly speaking opportunity for members of the tri-campus community at U of T to present insights and highlights of their research on a theme that is important and relevant to urban environments. It provides a platform for faculty, students, and researchers who are working to uncover solutions to creating more just, equitable, sustainable, and prosperous cities. Today's session of Knowledge Cafe features Dr. Laura Tozer, who will be discussing energy inequity and how energy retrofit programs and policies can address energy poverty. Laura Tozer is an assistant professor of environmental studies in the Department of Physical and Environmental Sciences at the University of Toronto Scarborough. Laura directs the Impact Lab, which is a community-based and policy-engaged research group focused on environmental politics and governance to address climate change. She has researched the planning and implementation of just, zero carbon, and resilient transitions in cities, the politics of transnational urban climate governance, and justice in the transition to renewable energy. Now, just before we begin, I'd like to cover a couple of housekeeping rules. Today's session will be recorded, and that has begun. We ask that all attendees keep their mics on mute for the duration of the presentation. And as well, during the presentation, we encourage you to put any questions you may have in the chat, and they'll be collected, and we'll try and answer them at the end of the session. Finally, please practice good etiquette. Anyone who is demonstrating inappropriate language or behavior will be removed. That all said, and without any further ado, I'd like to hand over today's session to Laura.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here today, and thank you to everyone for spending this time together with me for the next hour or so. So today we are talking about addressing energy poverty with climate action, and let me give you a bit of an orientation of what I'm going to talk about, and so that you can see what's coming up. So I'm going to talk to you about this overlap between energy poverty and climate action in buildings. And I'm doing that by drawing on some of my recent and ongoing work about how to catalyze equity-oriented energy transitions. So today I'm going to talk about climate action buildings and what we can do to address the climate crisis by transforming our built environment. This is really about what it will take to eliminate greenhouse gas emissions from our buildings and meet our climate goals. I'll frame this, though, in scholarship from urban climate governance that has been grappling with what it will take for climate action to move us towards justice rather than exacerbating inequalities. And we'll think in particular about energy poverty as an existing injustice in our energy system. I'll then offer some thinking that we've been doing in my research group to develop a framework for thinking about equity-oriented approaches to home decarbonization. So these retrofits that we do for residential buildings. And then I'll draw briefly on a couple of research projects I have in this area. One talks about addressing energy poverty through climate action with a policy approach. And this is drawing on work that's about orienting energy transition policy using a vulnerability-based approach to address the determinants of energy poverty while working at the same time towards a livable climate. And then I'll talk a little bit about a project that has a bit more of a bottom-up approach. This is a community-based action research project that I'm co-leading that's about how climate action relates to people's everyday hopes and concerns. And we're doing this project with partners focusing on underserved communities in Toronto. So that's a bit of an overview. Let's dive into climate action and buildings. All paths to successful climate action will go through old buildings. Energy transition discussions, they often overlook the fundamental role that will be played by reducing the amount of energy that we consume in buildings to maintain comfortable temperatures, whether that's heating or cooling. Reducing energy use is crucial but boring, is what one energy scholar wrote, Marie-Claire Bribois. And as a result, politicians and researchers too often fall into this trap of focusing on future technological innovation that's very unlikely to arrive on time, rather than the effective, politically supported, and technologically mature solutions that we have now for building decarbonization. And this is despite the fact that energy use in buildings is an essential area of climate action. Buildings in Canada produce almost 1/5 of the country's greenhouse gas emissions. This is from things like space and water heating and electricity use. And Canada has 16 million residential buildings that are contributing to these greenhouse gas emissions. Experts estimate that about 80% of the existing buildings that we have now will still be here in 2050. They will need to be decarbonized if we're going to be meeting our climate targets, our net zero targets by 2050. And in large cities in Canada, the challenge is even more pressing. Here in Toronto, for example, buildings produce more than half of the city's total greenhouse gas emissions. A lot of that coming from the natural gas furnaces that we use for heating. So what this all means is that a large-scale transformation of Canadian buildings, particularly our residential ones, but all of them, it's essential if we're to achieve the necessary steep decline in greenhouse gases and achieve net zero goals by 2050. So a large-scale transformation of Canadian buildings is essential to meet our climate targets. But what does this look like? What do I mean by that? Well, it looks like improving quality of life while consuming less energy through measures like insulation, deep energy retrofits, and changing practices. And this kind of bundle we often call energy efficiency. And that needs to be combined with switching from fossil fuels to electricity for powering heating and cooling. This is often called electrification. These are the technological components of building decarbonization, which I'll be calling retrofits in this presentation today as a shorthand. But it's also too limiting to view this transformation as solely technical. And we must consider the complex politics of energy use in the home. And that's the only way that we'll be able to understand how to reconfigure the built environment, especially if we want to work towards social justice outcomes. As it is now, the transformation of buildings is not going nearly fast enough to address climate change. In Canada, the rate at which we upgrade buildings needs to be 4 times faster than it is now, ramping up to 600,000 annual retrofits between now and 2040, for a total of 11.4 million retrofits. They also need to be deeper energy retrofits. In order to meet emissions targets in Canada, retrofits need to achieve double the level of energy reductions compared to the average retrofit today. So we have a lot of work to do. We've got to go faster and bigger when it comes to retrofits and building decarbonization. And that represents a really large-scale urban transformation challenge that we have to do in order to achieve decarbonization in Canada. But we know that politically, urban renewal, this kind of transformation, is far from benign. The work of countless scholars and activists shows us that existing systems that shape our communities structurally maintain and create injustices. The built environment that we live in now is rife with these kind of structural inequalities. And this includes energy poverty. Energy poverty rates in Canada range from about 6% of households in some communities, ranging up to 30% in some parts of Canada, such as the Atlantic region. 30% of households living in energy poverty. Recent literature on energy poverty argues that it's an expression of injustice. So building decarbonization is starting within this existing context of energy injustice, which makes it essential that any climate action that we're trying to do in this environment is designed to comprehensively address these injustices. If we think of this as just a physical transformation of our buildings that we're just kind of rolling out through technological means without trying to redress these injustices, then we will further reinforce them through this transformation. Now, let me take a minute here to dive more deeply into energy poverty and give you a bit of a definition and a sense of what that means. Energy poverty occurs when households have difficulty or cannot attain the necessary home energy services. And by this, I mean things like space heating, water heating, cooling, lighting, the use of appliances, anything that plugs in, all of these things that they have inadequate access to these kinds of energy services in the home. It's recognized as a form of deprivation worldwide, and it's estimated to affect more than 1 billion households. Today, I'm focused on Canada in particular, and I'm drawing mainly on literature that's focused on energy poverty in the global north. Many countries use the original UK definition of household energy poverty as having to spend more than 10% of household income to maintain comfortable home temperatures. Energy poverty research continues to build a lot of nuance, though, and illustrates a variety of determinants that may not solely be described by income or energy related factors, with underlying socioeconomic, demographic, and cultural dimensions providing a deeper understanding of the contexts in which energy poverty emerges. For instance, households grappling with energy poverty, they might include ones that are well heated or energy efficient, and even those that have undergone energy retrofits. In most of these cases, gender, age, family composition, health conditions, language barriers, immigration status may all play a critical role in determining vulnerability to energy poverty. Many reported cases of energy poverty also occur when households face multiple challenges that intersect and combine with detrimental conditions like high energy prices or really inefficient appliances. Energy poverty has quite a few impacts. Exposure to energy poverty can have damaging effects affecting people's mental and physical health, their stress levels, their emotional resiliency, their social relationships. So there's research showing that people don't want to have anyone over to their home when they're experiencing energy poverty. Maybe you can tell it's not heated, for example. A Canadian study found that exposure to energy poverty increases the odds of adults reporting poor general health and mental health. And some of these effects arise from the inadequate energy services directly, living in a house that's too cold, while others arise from a household being forced to choose between paying energy bills or buying food or medicine or paying the rent or buying clothing. Living without essential energy services can make chronic health conditions like arthritis worse, and it can increase the risk for respiratory and cardiovascular diseases. Space heating and cooling are important for comfortable indoor temperatures, given the cold winters and the hot summers in many parts of Canada. So sometimes when we think about, a house being too cold, people think in terms of comfort. And so I really want to drive home that home heating and increasingly cooling is literally a matter of life and death in many cases in Canada, as well as kind of the chronic health impacts it can have on people. And we sometimes think of Canada in cold winter terms, but increasingly the summers are getting hotter. We've seen heat waves, we've seen deaths attributed specifically to heat waves as well. So affordable home heating and cooling is a matter of health. But I'm talking about it here in this presentation because it's also a key part of the energy transition to address climate change. So let's talk a bit about the justice challenges and opportunities that we can think about when it comes to home decarbonization. When we think about decarbonizing buildings, that whole area of work is nestled within a broader debate, a broader area of work that's talking about whether urban climate action is or will be transformative in terms of advancing justice outcomes, or if it will be exclusionary in ways that exacerbate injustices. I've got two quotes up here from scholars who talk about the ways it has been exclusionary to date. It has tended to maintain dynamics of exclusion. They're talking about climate precarity, this ubiquitous condition, both in terms of exposure to impacts, but also in terms of very uneven access to low carbon technologies. Bryce Lavenda and Long write about climate apartheid, the uneven vulnerabilities to the climate crisis and inequitable implementation of these climate-oriented infrastructures. If we think of decarbonization of buildings as one of these climate-oriented infrastructures. So when we talk about addressing the climate crisis, we're talking about a huge mobilization of resources that we need is absolutely essential in order to meet that challenge. And a lot of the times we're thinking about rolling out low carbon infrastructural fixes, but these fixes are spatially selective. the default setting is to reinforce existing social, racial, economic, gender-based, and other forms of exclusion. So we have to be thinking about how to actively work against that tendency in the system. So climate action is not inherently addressing justice. But let me dive into the two sides of this. Let me talk a little bit specifically about building decarbonization to talk about the potential justice benefits, and I'll talk a bit more about the challenges. So home decarbonization has potential justice benefits, but also challenges related to justice. Building decarbonization can improve energy efficiency, and it can reduce the cost of heating and cooling a home, which can allow households to adequately and affordably meet their energy needs. And remember, this can also come with health benefits for people. Retrofits can be conceptualized as energy justice, depending on who benefits and how it's planned and implemented. In the US, a scholar named Lewis and colleagues argue that energy insecurity and energy burden should be situated as, quote, functions of structural racism manifested in decades of disinvestment in racially segregated neighborhoods, end quote. For many of these neighborhoods, injustices relating to building decarbonization and energy efficiency are deeply entangled with and really rooted in injustices related to housing, and often injustices related to the wider lack of provisioning of social and economic services. Okay, so we can use building decarbonization if we're taking kind of a restorative justice approach. Building decarbonization could target these communities where energy affordability and insecurity has been constructed over time through structural injustices. But there's also the potential that building decarbonization could drive further injustices. And this might include the uneven access to low carbon innovations. We've seen from research that access to these low carbon solutions has not been equitable to date, with underserved communities like low income households or renters less able to access the benefits of an energy transition. It would exacerbate energy injustices if retrofit programs failed to reach underserved communities, since only privileged groups would be able to benefit from zero carbon home upgrades. And this might be things like programs that are only targeted to homeowners, programs that exclude anyone who has really core housing need. That means that only, high income homeowners will be able to upgrade to modern, efficient, electrified, decarbonized homes. The other point I'll raise here is that building decarbonization can also exacerbate injustices if it's implemented in ways that negatively affect housing security. Because when we make all these upgrades to buildings, that can lead to rapid changes in the social, physical, and economic characteristics of neighborhoods. We're trying to reduce emissions, we're trying to reduce energy use, but it's changing a lot of the nature of the neighborhood. And so there's scholarship that's pointing out all of this low carbon gentrification that's taking place as we try to address climate change in cities. Without enough protections, this kind of building decarbonization work could lead to the gentrification if we're not kind of working on active anti-gentrification approaches. Or it could lead to renoviction in rental properties, where renovations displace existing tenants, either through evictions or rent increases. So, like all climate actions, home decarbonization, building decarbonization does not inherently deliver equitable outcomes. Instead, we need to work towards equity-oriented approaches to home decarbonization that actively aim to redress these entrenched inequalities. But the other point I want to make sure I leave you with on this particular slide is that decarbonization has potential justice benefits. We can do things like address energy poverty through home decarbonization. So thinking about this equity-oriented approach, I want to share with you this framework that's under development between myself and a couple of colleagues to think about what it would mean to take equity-oriented approaches to home decarbonization. I've got 4 points here on this slide, and I'm going to go through each of them and tell you a little bit about what we're thinking, and I'm looking forward to any feedback you have. The first point is about prioritizing a restorative justice lens. And I brought this up a little bit in my preceding slides, but really what this is reacting to is the fact that building decarbonization has been pursued with a framework that's focused on economic efficiency, where programs largely focus on cost and the amount of greenhouse gas emission reduction that you get per unit of cost. And this approach has been really widely applied across decarbonization modeling and practice, often really quite narrowly thinking about the costs and benefits. And it also is an approach that ignores the accumulation of injustices that have been disproportionately experienced by underserved communities. In the retrofit case, this approach has incentivized a focus on shallow retrofits in buildings, so measures that are quick and easy to install, but don't deliver a deep energy savings in a building. So it has incentivized this kind of shallow retrofit approach that reaches buildings that are the easiest to reach, the ones that are the cheapest to get into, and getting into a lot of them to add up to energy savings rather than kind of deeply transforming a home. And one potential outcome of this is that it can further neglect underserved communities that are often pegged as harder to reach, and it potentially excludes deeper retrofits for an individual home that are more likely to actually improve energy affordability for the household. So instead, this kind of equity-oriented approach to building decarbonization would start from a restorative justice lens, focused on the repair of harms that have been done to the environment and to communities. And this would include an effort to recognize and understand historical injustices that are shaping the current patterns of observed building energy efficiency inequities. So this would mean reorienting building decarbonization interventions to prioritize approaches that benefit underserved communities. So that's kind of the who, and this is a little bit of the how for the second pillar. This is about incorporating procedural justice. And this is an approach or a component of the framework that's really building on the assertion that underserved communities should be engaged in decision-making, have a voice, be able to exercise what's being called energy democracy in some of the literature, having this agency to participate and shape energy systems that they use. This is kind of linked to a right to energy narrative that's also growing, that focuses on energy as this inescapable element of modern, decent, dignified lives. And increasingly, it's also connected to the field that's talking about people not just as consumers of energy, which is kind of one of the only ways that well, maybe at least the predominant ways that people are taken into account when we think about energy systems. Instead, thinking about empowered citizens whose voices whose voices need to be recognized in how energy is used and produced in their communities. So this can mean authentically shaping retrofit program and policy design and aims, but it can also incorporate community-based approaches to implementation of retrofit. Home decarbonization can also be approached as a means to broader energy services equity. And this would be an approach that sees residential building decarbonization not only as an end in itself, but also as a means towards addressing broader energy injustices. And in order to kind of accomplish this, we really need that interventions don't solely rely on market mechanisms, and instead are better able to embed a broader societal commitment to valuing diffuse and multidimensional benefits that stem from upgrading people's homes, like the health improvements that are often not taken into account when we think about retrofit programs. And there's also a scholar, Buzarovsky, who's arguing about how we also need a more collective and politically disruptive approach to reconfiguring energy consumption in the home, and one that thinks about the potential contribution of a wider range of bottom-up interventions, the potential social reproduction contributions through things like reciprocity exchange and mutual support. So really driving home this point that to think beyond the narrow range that usually is hyper-focused on individual buildings or the insulation of those buildings, kind of the technical components, but also considering how to meet energy services collectively, like more co-housing, community spaces that could contribute, environmental measures like green spaces that cool neighborhoods. Now, not to say that we don't need insulation for buildings, we need installations and buildings, new windows and doors, but this is about widening the basket of potential solutions at play here. And the final component is about approaches that foreground identities, think about unique capabilities and lived experiences. And this is about considering the ways that experiences vary across identities. This is brought up in critical heat studies. Hampstead writes about this in the ways that different bodies experience heat in different ways. It's brought up by energy poverty scholars that talk about experiences of energy poverty, what it means to be in energy poverty, varying as well. And increasingly, scholars in this field are advocating for approaches focused on lived experiences of energy poverty and a capabilities approach centered on people's own perceptions of their energy poverty. Hampstead, again writing about critical heat studies, argues that research and practices really ignored to some extent, ignored the lived experience-based knowledge that illuminates this co-constitution of risk and identity, and calls for more of a focus on intersectionality in urban climate governance to think about how the everyday gives us some insight into how power, responsibility, and action are associated with different unequally situated bodies, as she writes. And similarly, some of my work with colleagues has looked at the determinants of vulnerability to energy poverty, and we've called for more holistic policies that are capable of orienting themselves to address intersecting injustices. Let me move now to tell you about those two research projects and kind of connect them to this framework and this challenge area. The first is thinking about addressing energy poverty through climate action using this kind of policy approach. And this is a project, this one I'll talk about today is based on a paper that's forthcoming in energy policy. And in this paper, what we did for this study is we developed a vulnerability-based framework that conceptualizes energy poverty as the resulting vulnerability from overlapping and compounding energy poverty determinants. What we did is we did desk research and a policy analysis, as well as interviews with 11 program administrators of low-income energy retrofit programs across 8 provinces in Canada. So this is the category of retrofit program that's specifically trying to reach low-income homes, and they often have kind of an income threshold that they're trying to reach with these programs. So we talked to all these program administrators about who their programs are reaching, how they could reach more homes that need retrofits the most. We talked about the design and aims of the existing energy retrofit programs that are targeting low-income households in Canada. And in this project and in this kind of broader area of work overall, what we found is that the public policy to support retrofits is far too small. I mean, you kind of heard this in my preamble as well. We've had a small number of programs. It's been growing, but it's still relatively small compared to the challenge of, 11 million retrofits in the next decades. The scope of the existing policy approaches is also, I think, one of the biggest issues is that it's not adequately reaching many Canadian households, many of whom need building upgrades the most. So the programs that we worked with in this study, we looked at a lot of programs that offer no cost or low cost energy retrofit measures to low income households. Often with a relatively limited scope, they're constrained by their budget for how many they can reach or the capacity of the program. That said, there are many policy gaps and many Canadian households are not reached. And some of the things that was brought up in the study include the fact that poor housing quality often disqualifies households from retrofit programs. So if, for example, in particular in cases where there's a compounding health risk, like if the home has too much mold in it, then it can be disqualified from a retrofit program, because the issue is much bigger than just energy, and they only are designed to deal with energy. Another issue is that eligibility of households is often narrowly defined in ways that potentially excludes a lot of households that are inadequately able to respond to housing-related harms, like if they have an old, inefficient building and they've got increasing energy costs that are intersecting with that. There are many homes that may not be below the income threshold, but that are never going to be able to deliver the scale of deep energy retrofit on their own that would address that affordability challenge, as well as meet the broader public goal of greenhouse gas emission reduction. Even when homes are eligible, some of the programs, they're targeted to low-income communities, but some of the programs don't cover the full cost of upgrades. And this is an area of that's a recognized barrier in the research that hinders access to energy retrofits for low-income households. One other thing that came out through this research is the way that programs are sometimes, quite often, driven by calculations of cost effectiveness that think about cost effective in a very centralized way, like the energy utilities cost effectiveness of delivering their programming, rather than a kind of affordability for the home orientation. Like, what can we do that's cost effective across the whole portfolio to achieve energy savings of X per year versus what can we do for this particular house that would address their affordability challenges. Also, many of the programs are focused on shallow measures, which are helpful, but there's less scope to be able to do some of the deeper retrofits. And there are programs that are oriented towards landlord-owned buildings, but not many. And renters are more likely to have access to shallow retrofit programs only. So for this, I can answer more about this if anyone has any questions later in the question period. But what I want to kind of highlight here is that when we consider the intersecting benefits of addressing health, affordability, climate resilience, and home decarbonization, it's clear that the kind of public investment in home retrofit opportunities is falling short. We're evaluating these programs on only one or two of those dimensions instead of the benefits that could be achieved across that full category of benefit for both. And some of it's a kind of a household level benefit, but a lot of it is a public benefit as well. So I'll switch now to talk a little bit about a bottom-up approach, and this is another research project. And this is one where we're thinking about addressing energy poverty through climate action in partnership with communities. So this project, the pictures are from the project. It's called the Just Transition Listening Project, and it tackles the challenge of trying to accelerate equitable transitions to cities that don't produce carbon pollution, while enabling all residents to live good lives and to be actively involved in this process of transition. So in the project, we're trying to understand together how climate action relates to people's everyday hopes and concerns and priorities for their neighborhood and for the city of Toronto. The listening sessions are action-oriented conversations that focus on people's connection to place, their aims for the future of their neighborhood, and how to empower climate action that works towards these aims. The listening project is guided by a steering committee that includes both University of Toronto Scarborough researchers and community partners from environmental and service organizations. So together we have been working on this question, and we did some research last year and we're doing some more research this year. And we've really focused on the question about what are the priorities of communities in Scarborough for the future of their neighborhood and city. And then we want to think together about how can climate action address these priorities? And what are the potential leverage points that can help generate momentum around implementing these climate actions? So like I said, here's a few more pictures from our research from last summer. We have several partners, and we are together running what we call listening sessions in various neighborhoods, all in Scarborough at the moment. And we're running some more of these listening sessions this summer. So we have several of them, but I'll just tell you about one listening session so that you can get a sense of what we've been doing. And also to think about the ways that this relates to this question of addressing energy poverty. So this is a listening session that was in the Golden Mile neighborhood in Scarborough. And I'm showing here this projected redevelopment that's planned, that's approved for the Golden Mile. 75 new buildings are approved in a transit-oriented development with investment in a new transit hub in this neighborhood. So this represents about 35,000 new units. And over the next 20 years, it will be a major hub for this neighborhood. Only 750 of these units are required to be affordable. This is all private, pretty much all private land that's being developed here, not public land. There's a target for these buildings to be near zero emissions for the new buildings. The existing neighborhood here, the Golden Mile neighborhood, or the area right around here, is home to diverse communities, with approximately 62% of the residents being born outside Canada and 76% identifying as visible minorities. Income and educational attainment rates fall below the city average. Average rents in this neighborhood is 14% less than other regions in Toronto. But even at these rates, many residents are still spending more than 30% of their income on housing. So clearly maintaining the affordability of existing housing stock is critical to this neighborhood. A lot of the places, the purpose-built rental housing in this neighborhood is old, and it's owned and maintained by the private sector. So we're not talking about a neighborhood where there's a lot of public housing, social housing. That's a lot of privately owned old buildings that are filling that role of affordable housing for people. So there will likely be an increase in property value with all this redevelopment, a change in the demographics, and a real risk of gentrification that would lead to the displacement of current lower income residents and block opportunities for new lower income residents to settle in the area as well. So we have a neighborhood here with a number of vulnerabilities to energy poverty. And this is what came out in the listening session. There was a lot of discussion about the rising cost of housing, about the old rental buildings in the neighborhood. So this is a neighborhood that has these potential vulnerabilities to energy poverty. It has a high proportion of newcomers as well. So it's a neighborhood in danger of a climate-related neighborhood transformation that has the potential to amplify many of the vulnerabilities that are the determinants of energy poverty. These are some of the projections for what the neighborhood will look like. So there's this challenge, but what we also talked about in this session was the potential to use the momentum around a neighborhood scale transformation. What are opportunities to intervene and redirect in ways that address existing vulnerabilities? So one of the things we focused on with the partner here was some ideas about trying to pilot innovative housing models that kind of delivered housing affordability within the context of this private redevelopment. I can tell you more about that if you're interested. So how can we use the momentum already underway in this place? And thinking more about what are the opportunities to catalyze climate action that prioritize existing residents' priorities for the neighborhood. And in particular, there was a lot of discussion about preserving affordability so that people can stay because their lives are in this neighborhood, and so that they have access to the public transit hub that's coming in here, because that's a big issue in Scarborough in general, for public transit. But a reason people lived in this neighborhood in particular was the way that it connected them to the city for work, and they could move around quite easily. So broadly across the Just Transition Listening Project, we're trying to work on connecting these priorities that we hear in the listening sessions to decision-making around energy transitions. So how can we harness climate action to address energy poverty is an ongoing challenge, and that we're grappling with in these projects and beyond. I hope I've shown some of the ways that climate mandates overlap and can help to drive action in other areas. Whether this is energy poverty or whether this is health, there's a lot of opportunity for combining a climate mandate with other mandates in ways that build momentum. Climate action is often approached as an extra expense, a specific policy area, a separate budget line item that we have to find new money for. And so what I'm trying to get across partly here is the way that climate action is actually deeply interwoven with our basic needs. It's about food, it's about shelter, it's about transport, and it's at the same time as being about a livable climate. And so how can we think about combining those mandates as a way to build momentum towards climate action? The other thing that's important to think about here is that, circling back to the retrofits in particular, the equity-oriented approach to delivering on these retrofits would start from this restorative justice lens that recognizes the structural injustices like energy poverty and works towards repairing them so that they wouldn't be the last homes that are reached through retrofit, but the first homes. And these approaches also have to incorporate procedural justice pillars in the design and the implementation of initiatives so that they better understand the needs and the preferences and the context of energy poor households and inefficient homes. And the other thing we brought up with the framework is trying to do that in the ways that recognizes these unique identities and capabilities and the lived experience of residents. So we've got to leverage this home decarbonization transformation that's underway to attain broader energy services, paying attention to some of these whole systems issues that have been raised kind of here and there throughout my presentation today: the rental costs, the gentrification, the rent eviction, the health, individual and community well-being. That said, the large scale and rapid transformation of Canadian buildings through deep energy retrofits, it's absolutely essential if we're to achieve the necessary steep decline in greenhouse gas emissions and attain our net zero goals by 2050. Transforming all our aging buildings can also bring an array of socioeconomic and other kinds of benefits, though. That's the key thing I want to leave with you with here, including addressing the national energy poverty challenge and the related health issues. Thank you so much for your time and attention today. I'm looking forward to answering your questions.
Thanks so much, Laura, for that really insightful presentation. So before we go to questions in the chat, I just want to ask anyone if you have a question right now, feel free to raise your virtual hand and you can say it out loud and for Laura to try and answer. So any questions from the group? Okay, as people think about that, we have a couple of questions in the chat. So the first one comes from Chi Si Chow. And the question is, should the carbon tax be used to facilitate the energy poverty improvement actions? Laura, do you have any thoughts on that?
Sure, I can talk about that. So we have had a lot of, I guess my first point on the carbon tax is we've had a lot of focus on the carbon tax to the detriment of other kinds of policies. So while I think it's a helpful tool, the single-minded focus on it has been a real problem in climate policy in general. Because it's very difficult to get the carbon tax high enough that it does what we needed to do, which is phase out fossil fuels completely. So, but that said, we do have one and it is generating income and we are using that towards lower carbon investments. And so one of the things that I think we should prioritize, as I've argued here, is that when we direct any kind of funding that we have towards climate action, that we prioritize climate action that has this equity orientation. Often, I would argue that this is particularly well suited for public funding, like direct public funding, because we get these multiple benefits and this multiple, all these mandates that that we have as a government to take care of people and to deliver public goods like greenhouse gas emission reduction. So for that reason, directing any kind of funding that we have, like public funding that we have towards equity-oriented climate action, I think is absolutely essential.
Thank you. Another question we have in the chat asks, how can public backlash against GHG mitigation policies be managed? I'm thinking about all the ads I see now about how the government wants to take away gas stoves and barbecues. And that's from Milan Nikki.
Yeah, good question. So I think that one of the key things for building public support for climate mitigation actions of all kinds are a couple things. One is to find ways where policies build coalitions of support. You need people who feel like they benefit from this climate action, because there are very strong coalitions against any of these actions, like the very well-funded natural gas associations and lobby groups that fuel that public backlash. It's not naturally occurring. There is fuel on the fire of that public backlash. So the policy development and implementation needs to do a similar kind of work in building coalitions of support. This can include communication kind of things, but it's also about people feeling the direct benefit of a measure. Like if you're giving, there are programs that are installing free heat pumps in the Atlantic provinces and in BC. People, feel that direct benefit of that climate-oriented program. And I think that the other thing to acknowledge is that there's always a huge engine of misinformation and denial and resistance coming from all the entrenchment of fossil fuels, financially, politically, technologically, across our society, that sometimes it looks like it's bubbling up into public resistance that's naturally occurring, but it's quite an active situation of fossil fuel entrenchment that we need to kind of counteract actively as well.
Thanks for that, Laura. Yeah, it's a major challenge overcoming public suspicion or opposition. Um, Another question we've got comes from Angela, who's asking, do you know of any energy retrofit programs that work with renters?
There are energy retrofit programs that work with renters. There's a good one on the East Coast in Nova Scotia that works with renters. I forget the name of it now, but I think Efficiency Nova Scotia is involved in the rental program. And the reason I'm highlighting it is because that program has an agreement that they ask landlords who participate to sign, saying that they are limited in the amount of rent increase that they can apply after they participate in this program. So they can still do some rent increases, the ones that are aligned with overall rent increases, but they can't do extra rent increases because the homes have been upgraded. There are other rental programs. A lot of them are programs that we will send in the mail a energy savings kit, like a low flow shower head and ceiling that you can put around your windows, things that are better than nothing, but aren't measures that would kind of transform the fabric of your home.
Thanks, Laura, for commenting on that one as well. The next question comes from Robert, who asks, can you talk more about the listening sessions? How are community members engaged or recruited? And what are their incentives or interests to participate?
So the listening sessions have been very different in their design and methods depending on the partner that we have to deliver them. So I told you about a set of sessions today that were in partnership with the United Way, who's on our representatives on our steering committee, and that one took a more of a focus group with compensation model. We've also done kind of a pop-up at a farmer's market with the Malvern Family Resource Center. So we had a stall at a farmer's market for 10 weeks and went back and had that's where many of the pictures that had the poster paper on them. We did things like kind of drop-in workshops where we take over picnic tables and we do community mapping workshops. We did things like ongoing community peer review where we'd put up, here are some of the things we heard about strengths of your neighborhood and issues with your neighborhood from last week. Check off what you agree with and what you disagree with. We have one partner that delivered a workshop series of arts workshops that were out in green spaces in Scarborough, the different places along the Greensway, and they did different kinds of arts activities that they taught people and gave them a chance to work with different materials and talked about the ways that they use that space, what they liked about the green space with their neighborhoods, using that kind of arts-based methods for engagement as well. A couple quick reflections. One was the asking what people like about their neighborhoods and what they want for the future of their neighborhoods was a very wide scope for people. They enjoyed it, especially when they were in community spaces, but it was broad. And also that the connections with climate action were not very evident. Anytime we talked specifically about climate actions, the conversation was not nearly as generative as if we were talking about transit in their neighborhood and green space and housing, things that all connect to climate action, but were not framed by people in those terms.
Okay, very, very interesting to hear about that. There are a couple of questions in the chat and they're sort of related, so I'll try and share them together. So Angela asks if you could comment on the public's interest in this and how energy retrofits aren't nearly as exciting as, say, access to nature or biophilic design, and how is the public feeling engaged and motivated with this? And Morgan Sinclair similarly asks about how politicians can enact revolutionary or meaningful climate action policies and present them in a way that gains popularity from the public. So I guess combining those questions together, the question is, how can you generate that public interest and engagement. Um, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, great question. And I think the group that is doing the best job of this right now is a group called the Affordability Action Council, who has done a really great policy brief, and they have a website you could check out that talks about affordability. I think it's about framing it for what people are prioritizing, the affordability of housing. We all want affordable housing. We don't want to live in homes that we can't afford to heat and cool properly. And we can think about interventions that are oriented around a livable climate, also in these affordability terms. I think there's a big opportunity to think about the ways that retrofits improve people's lives across these multiple dimensions that governments care about and that people care about for their homes. That there's a because I mean, they need to achieve energy and greenhouse gas outcomes, but because they've been put through that narrow lens to start with, it really narrows the number of people who are excited about that policy aim. So I think there's a big opportunity to widen that policy aim in with an angle that would be much more exciting for both politicians and for people. The thing about the fact that it's not exciting for people, it's really interesting because it's one of the retrofits for buildings. It's the fact that we don't need to do a ton of technological innovation. Yes, we need to do some, but we don't need to do a ton of technological innovation. And we have so many cost-effective solutions should mean that this is the easiest of climate actions to do. But because we're talking about getting into every single building and there's all this, this complex politics of energy use in homes, we've really underestimated and underemphasized this as a policy area. So it should be exciting because it's doable. We are oddly, and maybe not oddly, but we are overly excited about the ones that seem magical. But I think that we can take advantage of the fact that building decarbonization is so doable by connecting it to these everyday priorities that people have about what it means to live a good life.
Thanks for that as well. So yeah, connect the energy improvements to regular daily priorities that people have. Um, we might have time for one more question or two more as we wrap up at one, but for anyone who didn't get their question answered or we didn't have time to cover it, we'll send the questions in the chat or that were sent before to Laura as well to consider in the future. So there's a question I see in the chat from Frank who says, thank you for a very thought-provoking session. And has there been any research that links better health outcomes to reduction of energy poverty, especially in terms of overall financial benefits?
Studies that link better health outcomes to reduction of energy poverty. Yes, there have been studies. There a lot of the Canadian specific ones are relatively new. There's a project that Milan Riva and Runa Das are doing that is looking specifically at the Canadian context. But in terms of the evidence base from more countries, yes, there's evidence that addressing energy poverty can improve health outcomes for people. With the caveat that there's very intersecting determinants of those health issues and the energy poverty, a lot of different determinants that are leading people to be in energy poverty. So that can mean that there's a varying degree of impacts on their health and outcomes. And was there a financial part of that question too, or did I capture it all?
I think the question was just about how, yeah, improving finances and reducing poverty.
Oh yeah, so it's really about, yeah. So if you're able to afford the energy services that you need, then you have better health outcomes because you're not having to do things like live in a house that's too cold while you have this arthritis, or choosing to heat your home rather than pay for your medicine.
Thanks as well for that answer, Laura. So that brings us just to the end of this session today. Thanks again to Laura. We could give her a round of applause for a terrific presentation, some original and very insightful research. Um, and this is our final Knowledge Cafe of the academic year, but we'll be back in September. So thanks for everyone for attending and for being so involved. It's clear that everyone is super interested in this and creating a more just energy future. So thanks to everyone for joining, and thanks again to Laura. Have a great rest of the week.